We will have a presentation by today's featured speaker, Dr. David Broadstock, Senior Research Fellow and the Division Head with the Energy Study Institute, where he also has the Energy Economics Division. Dr. Broadstock is a specialist in the areas of energy and environmental economics with around 15 years of experience in academia, consulting, and strategic policy research at think tanks. Then we will have an open Q&A discussion moderated by Dr. Kim Cheong-won, who is a research fellow at the Energy Study Institute of National University of Singapore. Dr. Kim has extensive experience in energy and environmental research and sustainable development project management in international organizations and research institutes. She is currently leading the research projects about carbon pricing and net zero strategies in Singapore and other economies. Today's session is part of our virtual training workshop on electricity markets in a high renewables world. So the workshop participants are welcome to address your question live by raising their hands and turning on their video. All other attendees are also welcome to send the questions through the Q&A box, which Dr. Kim will raise during the discussion. Finally, we will wrap up and close with remarks from Dr. Sitharam, Senior Consulting Specialist at Asian Development Bank Institute. We now officially begin the session. I invite Dr. David Broadstock to take the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let me just begin by sharing my screen. And I believe you should be able to see my front page.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And I'll just minimize the image of the participants. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share in this virtual public dialogue. My name is David Broadstock. There's been a rough introduction already to my background and my perceptions on the world. And this is very much from the lens of an economist. And so I'm going to be offering a few remarks which are targeted towards, sorry, there's some background noise. I think there may be an extra microphone switched on somewhere. But I'm going to be offering a few minutes of remarks that talk towards the nature of energy market transitions, and particular power market transitions, really, in the face of renewable fuel deficiency. I fear there may be some background noise. There may be one or two microphones left on, just in case it's one of you. You might possibly just double check your microphone. Power market transitions in the face of renewable fuel deficiency, and with the context that we're going to be looking at the world from, in particular, the Singapore perspective, where we have a high energy import dependence. Now, there's one version of looking towards this which says, well, Singapore may not be necessarily the most interesting case study, but I would argue that actually in many ways, Singapore presents a very good case study for many other countries, because we suffer many unique characteristics, and I choose the word suffer a little carefully, but we suffer many unique characteristics which are almost like exaggerated versions of what you might find in other economies. And so I think the Singapore context is actually quite useful as a reference point. The virtual dialogue builds upon a workshop which has been running for the past day and a half, 2 days, which is done together with the ADBI and colleagues from Stanford University. And for those who came from the sessions in that workshop, I thought it was a really, really fascinating workshop and a great job. Well done by Professors Thurber and Wallach. Lots and lots of insights to be garnished in this workshop. And what were the purposes of this workshop, and what is the purpose of this virtual dialogue? In many ways, it begins with knowledge transfer to deepen the understanding of electricity market dynamics. And this is really so that we can undertake that role to help better formulate effective electricity market policies. And I think within the workshop, there was some opening remarks and 2 points were made, which were very salient from my perspective. These are, first, that these markets are extremely complicated and only getting more complicated. And this is very true. There's nothing about power markets which is very simple. And the closer you get to real market operations, the more complex you see. And the closer we get towards the exciting versions of these power markets, which is the versions we're hoping to transition into, again, the more complex they become. And this is something to keep in mind. There's another point which was made, which was that when we think about power markets and when we think about transitions, we must recognize that we cannot just instantly build a new power plant to alleviate some market challenge. And this is particularly relevant at this point in time, because part of the message that I will play through is how overwhelming, perhaps is a useful choice of word, the current market challenges are, and what risks we may be facing in terms of steering transition discussions, given that these risks are presenting a need to perhaps look for near-term solutions to these challenges. And you know, we'll caveat that as we go through the narrative. So this is, you know, a discussion which builds, you know, when I first proposed the abstract and a title for this talk, the world was in a different place. In the past couple of weeks, the world is really trying to come to grips with how extreme are the challenges which we're currently facing. And I don't think we can navigate away from that. So I'm going to try and complement the knowledge transfer which has been done through the workshop and towards the participants in that workshop with an additional set of questions almost around, well, how do we continue to complete the type of transition in power markets that we would hope to see, despite the conditions which we're facing, of which renewable energy is a very important component. So what is an energy transition and why do we need one? It's useful just to really think of these core characteristics. An energy transition, the way I like to think of it, is the process of upgrading the powertrain that we have, the power system itself, such that we have a more complete commitment to the use of low emissions technologies, which would include renewables, and ideally such wide-scale deployment of such low emissions technologies that we can have a power system that can help achieve net zero. And net zero is a commitment which many economies are creeping towards, some faster than others, some not openly. We have long-term strategies which are being committed by countries, but at present there's only around about 50 countries, just a fraction more than this, that have provided long-term decarbonization strategies towards the official communication channels. So net zero is there. It's an important part of the story, but it's not yet a defining characteristic for everybody. But we're certainly hoping to get that very, very low stroke net zero type emissions structure behind the power generation capacity within our economies. Ideally, we will not just transition to cleaner fuel sources, but we'll also begin to build upon the use of smart technologies, distributed energy resource networks, where energy flows from multiple directions into the system and between multiple participants within the system, they retailers, generators, gentailers, gencos. I mean, there's a lot of complexity that you can build in, but that idea of a clever network is also part of that idea of that energy transition, so that we can intelligently optimize not just the power generation, but also the usage patterns that come coupled with the power generation fleet. And energy storage systems are not really something that we've discussed throughout the workshop in any great depth, but the roles that energy storage can play within future energy systems are very important, because energy storage, well, one of the defining characteristics of power markets is that they have a rather large amount of volatility. I'm going to use that word quite a bit. We can say variability in the price outcomes. And there's reasons why this exists, and workshop participants will have been through many thought processes in the past 2 days to understand what some of those reasons are. Potentially there's options through the use of energy storage systems to help navigate away from some of these more extreme uncertainties. Why do we need an energy transition? Well, I think this is something we all understand. In today's power markets, the risks of high hydrocarbon content are clearer than ever. We are more acutely aware than ever that there are anthropogenic consequences to the use of hydrocarbons, which are being manifest in rather extreme weather events that are risking people's well-being and in many cases lives around the world. And this is happening at a greater frequency. Resolving the use of hydrocarbons within the power market will help in alleviating stresses driven by this. And then, of course, we have an increasing awareness of just the general need to be responsible in all of our endeavors. And so, you know, these things are certainly becoming clearer from those that create and use power through to those that facilitate the flow of financial capital to help the investments that allow that power to be generated. Long-run decarbonization will require high renewables content, certainly much higher than we have in most cases today. Now, what do we want to say about Singapore's particular version of the power market story? Well, we are quite simple in that we have, from the power market perspective, a market where the end users go through fairly conventional use cases. They may wish to light their homes, use, in particular in Asia, rice cookers or similar for cooking, or electric cookers and microwaves, computers and TVs, cooling, and potentially even transport via electricity. And so we have all of the traditional end users, and the end users will be a combination of residential and business. There's nothing unusual in that sense. And we have a fairly conventional power generation structure in that we have a market which has a wholesale element, including generators, and we have a retail division, and retailers may or may not be involved with power generation. And this has created some complexities in market operations within the past 12 months. We won't delve into that story today, but we're not very unusual in that sense. But where we get quite simple is on the fuel input side of things. In Singapore's case, we use approximately 90 to 95% of natural gas to create the electricity which we use in our economy. And so we have essentially a single supply source. And the reason for this, one of the reasons for this, is actually that we do not have indigenous fuel resources. We do not have our own gas. We do not have our own oil. We do not have topography, land features that allow us to deploy a full range of renewable technologies. Hydropower within the economy is fairly limited opportunities to deploy. We have limited available space. Singapore is 100% urbanized as an economy. And so there's limited room for renewable energy deployments. It's not a technological barrier so much as a simple space barrier. And so we're now in that particular place where we have almost 100% import dependence on a single fuel source. And that's convenient because it simplifies the version of the story that we want to unpack or need to unpack in understanding where the risks are that face the Singapore power market. And those risks, all I'm going to say, I mean, I've communicated, I think, some of the points on this slide already, which are quite simply, now, you know, if I was to try to not repeat a similar type of story to that which we've heard before, which is that we need an energy transition, that we need to decarbonize. Instead, I'm going to try to play towards the story, how is that becoming more difficult than it was maybe 6 months ago or 12 months ago? And there are some durable features. We certainly are finding that the change in global market characteristics for natural gas within the past 2 to 3 years have been presenting risks to Asia, the Asian LNG prices and similar, and Singapore has felt some of that. But certainly within this year, with Russian oil and gas removed from global supply chains, we've found that there are very new dynamics to global markets. And this ultimately is creating a new energy and financing puzzle. And this is words that I've had presented to me recently, which I think is a very interesting way to actually think about where we're going with energy transitions. Because the puzzle, the reason it's a puzzle is because we're potentially looking at a version of two options where neither are very attractive, that we have to make energy transitions which, among other things, not just need to be clean, but need to be resilient. And in some cases need to be done quite quickly. As we approach a winter seasonal spike for energy demand within Europe, for example, energy needs to be provided to make sure that homes can be heated and health does not get placed at risk. And so what this all means is that we have a change in balance of priorities at the moment, and I'll come back to that later. Whilst clean energy is central to the transition, clean energy is not always something that we can provide. And again, Singapore, I've already highlighted that we face a very unfortunate situation that we can't scale up renewable deployment locally quickly without increased technological improvements. And so I'm going to present the idea that in order to facilitate the transition moving forward from where we are today, conditional on some new market environments, let's say, that actually we're not yet at a point of having a good, clear understanding of the risks which we face in the intermediate term, let's say the next 5 years. And that if we don't think carefully today, there's a possibility that there could be sort of path dependencies in choices we make today, which could have consequences to longer term transitions. The other part of this slide is simply to highlight the message I've tried to communicate at the moment. Why is Singapore an interesting case study to actually explore some of these uncertainties? It's because Singapore doesn't have complete control over some of these uncertainties. And the word I have here to refer to this is that actually we are in a scenario where we have import dependence that creates an exogenous risk. We're small, we can't control global market prices, we can't influence them. And so we take the prices which are presented to us, and that's where the risk becomes beyond our control. But Singapore is an interesting case study, one, because we have that, and we have that for 95% of our fuel supply chain for the power sector. And many other countries will have similar types of risks, but it won't be quite as extreme. It will be a proportion of their fuel mix that might have that exogenous risk. But certainly when it's pretty much all of your fuel that has those exogenous risks, you get, let's say, an intensified version, an ability to really clearly identify the consequences, the extent and consequences of such risks, and really play through what they mean towards potential transitions much more easily with the similar messages applying elsewhere. Singapore has a good institutional environment, and it has very strong decarbonization ambitions. It has a robust level of local resources, not energy resources, but other resources, insofar as it's not a poor economy. It has the ability to engage with global markets, as it has some advantages in terms of being quite well located from a logistical perspective, and it has well-defined financial markets and legal institutions. And all of these have made investment and trade activity within the region rather impressive relative to the size of the economy in terms of a physical footprint. And as I say, the high energy import dependence, and also the fact that it's from one single fuel source pretty much, makes it a little bit easier to reduce the story to a point, or reduce the image of the economy to a point that's easier to look at and understand. And so I would argue that there's certainly a version of this which says that Singapore's lessons learned do have transferable elements, and so I hope you buy into that. So where are we in the world today? I think it is useful to condition our questions relating to transition upon this. Are we facing just another energy crisis is one question I would like to pose. Certainly we hear nowadays an awful lot of discussion around an energy crisis, and just to caveat this, what this has resulted in the supply side of the crisis is, for example, in many European countries, we're beginning to see energy rationing and very extreme responses, extreme conditional on what we understand from how markets operate within the past 50, 60 years, at least in places like Europe. But maybe not so extreme if we go back just a bit further. If we were to talk about 80 or 90 years ago, then we would see rationing in response to other conditions at that time. But it is useful to really try to work out, is there anything here that we don't recognize? Or you know, are we just seeing the same sort of thing that we've seen in the past? So first of all, let me apologize for the axes on these plots. It's not going to be very easy to see the dates on the bottom, but you can look towards the top, and where appropriate, I indicate, just as it's loading up, I indicate on the subtitle to the slide the date range so that you can get some comprehension. And on this particular graph, I have a couple of things which I want to put across. We have a period here. I'm just going to zoom in here, and let me just highlight what I have on this plot. I have on this plot information on energy-related commodities taken from the World Bank Pink Sheet, which run, my data goes from 1960, January if I recall, through to just 2 months ago, but I'm only showing up until 2010 for a moment, just to help you follow the story. We've had many energy crises in the past, and one of these was in 1973, give or take, and this here is what happened to the commodity prices. In my data, I have natural gas, I have crude oil, which is the orange line that you can see, and then we have the coal, a coal index, and I can give you more detail externally if you want to verify precisely which ones. It's the South African coal index there. And so in 1973, we had one of the more significant oil price crises in recent history. And what this saw was the price rise from, you know, around about 5 points on the index that we have up to about 15, 16. And this was a significant event at the time. In the context of Singapore, this converted into a 2-year average inflation of about 20%. And so global economies were rattled by this. And if you look back into the history of oil markets, you'll see that, you know, this is something that actually created an awful lot of definition. That is dwarfed in relative terms by what occurred in and around more later years over to the right here, where we have the global financial crisis, especially towards the back end here. And so the global financial crisis occurred roughly at the same time as a combination of energy market sort of mini crises, a lot of dynamics at the time. But put those details aside for a moment. What I'm trying to communicate is actually the extent of the problem. And so what we thought we knew was a crisis gets displaced in recent years by something that is considerably more significant. Where are we today, though? That's an interesting question. The answer is here. Over here was a oil market crisis that redefined our understanding. I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Sorry, bear with me 2 seconds. There we go. Over here was the oil market crisis. Over here was the global financial crisis. And over here is where we are today. And for many of the energy commodities, we're seeing a persistent increase in prices across the board. And this is where we're feeling the squeeze at the moment. So I think it's fair to say that we are actually in very legitimate uncharted territory, and that we don't yet actually have a concrete understanding of the risks which we're facing. And so, you know, I'll try to bring these all back to the point of, well, what does this mean for energy market transitions? What are the complications for power markets, for renewables, and so forth? For now, I'm just going to continue my journey of trying to understand the uncertainties and how they may be presenting themselves to us. For Singapore, those uncertainties here, which include, if I just switch off the oil and the coal index, the gas index is now at 450% where it was even just within a year or so back. How does that translate into an economy where natural gas is the primary fuel source? We've seen an awful lot of tariff revisions, but actually if we were to take a look, and this graph includes all of the forecasted settlement prices as well as the actual settlement prices within the blue shaded areas, versus the orange line, which is the actual current tariff rate, which is provided to customers. And the question is almost really just a simple one of, well, how often are we seeing those lines cross, and especially the blue parts going above? And actually, it seems maybe from one perspective we're fairly well shielded, and this is because we have the ability to use futures contracts, which were discussed within the workshop elements. Futures contracts and long-term supply contracts, which help shield against spot market uncertainties, and I should caveat that those commodity prices are probably more reflective of those spot market uncertainties. But we're certainly not safe. If we look back, sorry, my navigation is not keeping pace. If we look back, this is actually September the 9th this month, just a few days ago. If we look back even just to September the 9th, we see that volatilities within Singapore's context mean that prices, the full range of prices, for example, during periods of the day, are not able to have any forecast point that falls below the tariff rate, which is quite concerning. It means that we're potentially facing quite significant inflationary pressures. And if we look further back, we see that this is a repeat story, and we're not immune to risks. There are periods of time where those risks are considerable and sustained, and these are creating near-term pressures. That's really the story that I'm trying to communicate here. The forecasts are useful, but it's perhaps a little bit more insightful to be thinking about the settlements. And if we just do that for a second, we can see that the settlement prices are also down at the bottom of my graph here. There's still a horizontal line that reflects the tariff rate, and the period of data here runs from October 2021 until just the 13th of September, so effectively a year's worth of data. And if we look at the range close to the tariff rate, we see that there is an awful lot of pressure being presented by the wholesale power market towards the economy, owing to a potential mismatch between where the tariff rates sit and the actual costs of producing the electricity, taking the understanding that the settlement prices actually reflect that. If we switch off the settlement price for a moment and just concentrate on this this brown shaded line here, this indicates the 60-day moving average settlement price on the local markets, and we see, if we were to look at this from a policy perspective, if we concentrate, for example, in just this region, there's an interesting question you might ask as to where that difference is featuring within the economy, because the costs of producing the electricity are sustained at a level quite substantially above the cost of selling that electricity. Now, these markets, as mentioned at the very beginning, these markets are complex. It's not just the one tariff rate which goes to every consumer. There's an awful lot more detail to this. But the divide between these two is quite an issue. The fact that it's been kind of converging over time is promising, but one might argue that it should ideally still be creeping lower. Historically, it was much lower, closer to $70 to $100 if we talk about several years back. Okay, so what then do I learn from this? I learned that there's potential price mismatches which are creating significant short-term complexities. I know that there's risks within the power market which are emanating through a combination of conditions which have emerged within the past few years and strengthened by changes in global supply market dynamics for the fuel sources which power the economy. And if I look towards a different perspective on the local market risk and just follow the narrative, a version of the slides will be made available. But if I look towards the futures markets for the electricity contracts, and if I look a couple of years back, this dark green area is how they used to behave. In Singapore's context, we had a market shakeout, which resulted in some retailers within the power market suddenly exiting, and that's what this period here defines, and the period which follows around about here is closer towards the crisis which was driven from Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And so we see that the impacts of global gas and oil markets and everything else which was connected with this created a fundamentally different perception on how the markets should be, or on how market expectations were. What is kind of interesting is at the back end of the futures curve, there was a sense of calmness. For a period of time, the futures just stopped going anywhere in the tail end. But the bit which intrigues me is actually this whole area to the right here. And so let's take that red peak as conflict and global energy market reorganization. What we have is we have local market conditions that, if we argue that the futures markets, excuse me a minute. If we make the argument that the futures markets reflect local expectations, which is not at all unreasonable, then we've seen a structural change in the way that those expectations look. There was uncertainties, but there's a change without reversal. And so what does this then mean? It means we have local risk characteristics, which are a function of global risk characteristics, which all have different patterns of uncertainty. But we have spikes on one side, we have what appears to be a bubble in the commodities, and we have a structural break in the local power generation related risks. And piecing these all together is very complicated. And then on top of this, we have traditional market operations. And I won't dwell on the graph, the nature of the graph here, but if we were to say, are these risks within the power market defined by proper fundamental conditions? Are there perhaps exceptions to this? I think it's fair to say that there's potentially still exceptions, and we haven't navigated away from that. And the current power generation fleet makes it possibly a bit easier to have such risks. If we were to contrast steady behavior throughout, this is actually June through to September, intraday demand is going across 30 minutes of the day along the axis that I'm drawing the mouse along now. If we were to look at that, we would find it difficult to say that prices should have a sudden spike within the middle. And the resort to engineering explanations or constraints doesn't always marry up against the extent of these market volatilities which can creep in. And you could then argue that potentially if we modify the power generation fleet to include potentially simpler technologies such as solar, we may be able to navigate away from such extreme uncertainties, but there's potentially fitting features that also help to define this. So in any case, my slides contain more information than I need to go through, but there's certain messages which correlate through everything. I know that there are risks, and if I look towards the invisible versions of these risks, and this graph it contains a whole ton of information, but something like this tells you what's happened. If I step back and say, okay, I've got complex data and I want to really understand what is the structure of the uncertainties that underlie this. We have new conditions where they're increasingly high now compared to where they've ever been before. And what the full graph says is that if I look towards the futures contracts, if I look towards the spot contracts, if I look towards the commodities, I can't remove these underlying uncertainties, but I can also characterize parts of these as bubbles. We saw bubbles occurring. And so we have structural changes, we have bubbles, we have imbalances between production costs and supply conditions. So let me skip along through a couple of slides just so I can get towards the key point. I ultimately am trying to pin down, do we have a clear and concrete understanding of these? And really, if you try and present the question of, do we have a sufficient body of research which, first of all, actually tries to really think about what are the consequences of those electricity and power market uncertainties and their consequences to the economy? The answer there is actually still not really yes. I wouldn't say it's quite no, but if you've been following what I'm saying, really what I'm saying is I get information provided to me from commodities markets, which goes at one speed and presents one picture. I get information provided to me by futures for those commodities, which goes at a different speed with different markers. I have information on the local power market, which has the spot and the futures combinations, which is fairly familiar to most. And then we have tariff rates, which are revised on a quarterly basis. And we're supposed to be able to work out what are the consequences of all of this so that we can create a higher level of urgency for the transition to make sure we don't suffer those consequences. But actually, if you really question, and I'll skip beyond just a couple of slides. If you really try to seek insight as to how that actually all plays through, if you wanted to present that question, what would be an objective value of the benefits of expanding renewables by X%? It's not so easy to do, and there's a combination of market structure and also basic technical considerations. So, how then do I draw this all to an important discussion? Take it as given that we're in unique times, and these times are not the sort of times that we can easily connect back through to experiences we've had in the past. And then get back to the idea of the energy transition. We certainly know that we want to deploy new technologies, but we do know that we can't deploy new technologies quickly. But all of the pressures that we're facing right now actually provide a very nice incentive in some ways to try to deepen that commitment to renewables. But then we shouldn't lose sight of the constraints which we have. And in fact, we maybe want to think more carefully about them, what opportunities they require us to commit to. And that's a very powerful and persuasive way of looking at things, I feel. In Singapore, there's, like many other countries, we have an idea of what we should be doing to create domestic power market resilience. And one of the most useful reference points to be thinking about this is the Energy 2050 Committee report, which was commissioned by the local energy market regulator, the Energy Market Authority. And this is really talking towards what are the steps required to achieve, let's say, a decarbonized power sector by 2050. Of course, renewables will play an important role within this. How does that look? If you turn to the report, you'll find numbers relating to these. It includes geothermal, which is something that's being explored within Singapore and potentially could give us, I think the number here is around about 15 to 20% of power supply. But that won't be enough for the economy, of course. We can further expand solar, and this graph here relates to actually the first of 3 pathways which the report suggests could be viable, which include a clean energy renaissance. So this is the clean energy renaissance. We've been lucky, we've been able to develop the technologies and deploy them in scale. There's a climate action block and then an emergent technology block, and these involve essentially different commitments to nuclear and hydrogen. The nuclear being, climate resilience if you're not able to get the full green, clean technologies, and the emergent technology is, hydrogen becomes a very big thing. But the key points to take away here, and certainly we have hydrogen as a big thing here as well. One of the key things to take away is actually that we do not navigate away from the need for energy imports. And so with all of the technology we have available presented to us today, still there are challenges to how much we can fully deploy renewables within the system. We respect the fact that they could create different risk opportunities. We can diversify against the risks which we're facing right now. And we would very much love to accelerate investment bring forward investment to enable us to transition away from the global energy market risk faster and in a cleaner orientation. But that doesn't solve the land space problem. And so this then is very enlightening. And the other feature of this is that Singapore, I believe, through this report, I find very interesting to read, because one of the additional points they commit to is that, well, if you're really wanting to approach the concept, the process of energy transition in a careful manner, you need to realize that there's potential pathways which you may need to navigate between, depending on changeable conditions. And that's very nice, but it's potentially very expensive as well, because it almost means that you have to be ready to switch on to nuclear within a near time frame, even if your primary objective is to have this type of a fuel mix where maybe nuclear is not a piece of this. And so within the report, there's discussion around small nuclear reactors, modular type systems. So that's potentially very expensive and creates redundancies of its own type. And so that then acts as a very pertinent reminder that the pathways are not clear. And this report was prepared pre any of the current conditions that we're facing right now. And so this is a very humble point tonight. The broader policy context which matters, we have ongoing policy environments which create changeable conditions for market participants, let's say. We have carbon pricing policies which are evolving. Within the workshop, we recognized that there was room for thinking about how carbon prices impact the power generation process, and that these can create preferences over certain technologies. Let's say the less carbon that's being emitted is going to be suffering less from the carbon price which is added on to pay for the externalities. Singapore has a very interesting trajectory, and domestically there's one feature of this, which is that the 2030 target is going to be pinned against internal carbon pricing practices, which is essentially a market reference, a market-based benchmark, which is intriguing. But there's a changing carbon policy market environment, and there's global foundations to that. And when you have import dependence, the global market conditions will matter as well. There's official documents which people within the economy look towards for guidance. These include, for example, nationally determined contributions, which all countries agreed to submit. And the nationally determined contributions are an interesting reference point for what could be legitimately committed to within our efforts to decarbonize the economy, including the power sector. But the NDC documents, these really only set forth targets. And within that, we don't have, in my view, I feel, a very intelligent description of how we do this within the power sector. Often, the power sector is conflated with the transportation sector, which may or may not be correct, but it certainly doesn't leave much room for specificity in that reference point. And these NDC documents are revised through time, which makes it a little bit difficult for investment to organize around those targets. But of course, the most ambitious investors will often pursue opportunities that are exceeding our commitments and targets. And then we have long-term strategies which set another reference point. And really the key thing I want to indicate here is that actually many countries are still questioning what is the end point. Is decarbonization as far as possible what we commit to? Is net zero what we commit to? Is it 2060? Is it 2050? And these are important in positioning the ambition towards deploying renewables and so forth. So I may have, I think, within this talk possibly deviated a tiny bit from maybe what even myself I was expecting to talk about within just 2 weeks ago. But I still think that this is really the version of the conversation which has a lot of interesting characteristics right now relevant to all of the parties attending or organizing this event. Energy market transitions in the face of renewable fuel deficiency and import dependence are a problem that we all face in varying degrees. We all need to be making the energy transition. We need to be doing this so that we can decarbonize. But what's happened in recent times is that questions around the process of decarbonization, I want to highlight a sentence here, these have not become any less important in recent times. But we're certainly realizing that relative to other challenges which are presenting global economies right now, the global energy market as a whole, the inflation problems, the responses to this, are placing the energy questions down the pecking order. And then there's also responses to the energy crisis which we're facing, which maybe create material risks. I may take just 1 or 2 extra minutes, John, but only 1 or 2. This is my last slide. The reason I say that is because one other feature which comes to my mind when I think about what's happening at the moment, we think about the energy crisis in the UK context, households are struggling to pay energy bills. And it was announced that there would be a package worth £150 billion in order to help households cope with this. Well, we're borrowing from the future, and we're diverting investments away from alternative energy solutions. That's £150 billion which cannot be deployed to invest in new renewables. And so there's a lot of things happening all at the same time because of what's going on. The renewable fuel deficiency, one thing I note towards within my discussion here, certainly we need more investment. We do need to scale up as far as we can. We need to optimize the renewable solutions that we have. But I'd argue that that investment doesn't only need to be in pure infrastructure. There still needs to be work at the research and development phase. For example, a discussion I heard recently was how curved solar panels could be a very important element to the future deployment of renewables, because it really opens up how you integrate renewables within an environment with visual amenity, whilst at the same time optimizing the surface space of buildings and the likes in order to be able to provide as much solar as possible. But that would require not just investment in deployment, it's investment in the research phase. High energy import dependence, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to rethink how import dependent we want to be. And with that thinking, we must remember that nations trade for a reason, typically, in normal market conditions. And whilst we're feeling pressure to create resilience and reduce import dependency, if there were no unusual market conditions, we'd still want to trade because we both get gains from trade. Everybody who trades with each other, in principle, is able to create some positive gain from doing so. And those narratives need to be remembered. And especially in the context of a country like Singapore, where there's no escape to self-sufficiency in the near term. And so with that, how we continue to build upon multilateral energy market cooperation will be important. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts. I'll pass the floor over to John to moderate the discussion.
Thank you, David. Yeah, thank you for your great and interesting presentation. Okay, now I will open floors for questions from audiences. So, okay, I've got a question. Okay, in the chat box, I have seen many countries have transitioned from older scheme of command and control to free market for electricity. Do you think that such a transition helps solve energy trilemma? Electricity price in Thailand being tied to natural gas prices as a global commodity is not friendly for consumers lately, and policymakers are facing political pressure to continue to rely on command and control structure. In Thailand, we are still using enhanced single buyer scheme. Yeah, that's the first question.
Thank you. It's a very good question, and very much strikes towards the heart of where I think the the challenges that people engaged in the energy sector really need to address at the moment. So, there's an interesting question. Should we be subsidizing fuels, for example? Does it remain consistent with our desire to decarbonize if we're making it cheaper for people to purchase polluting fuels to facilitate their daily activities? And of course, if we remove those, then there's a welfare consequence, especially towards the poorer parts of society, who will feel the impact of those increased fuel prices much more quickly and much more severely, and that's not desirable. There's an alternative perspective, which is to say, well, if you want market to organize appropriately, you need prices to be set at the proper point. And if consumers are not evaluating their consumption behaviors based upon proper prices, instead there's some adjusted price, then that's potentially a problem. Then there's the other side of this, which says, well, if you recognize that there's externalities, and then you don't just need to remove the subsidy, you kind of need to go the other way even. And these are very challenging questions, because we're now given all of the additional pressures, not to detract away from the importance of energy, but what surprised me recently is how much I've heard energy sector specialists talking about the possibility that what they're saying about the energy sector is becoming increasingly redundant, not because it's less important, but because other economic pressures have grown in importance. And so, it's a tricky thing. I'm not sure if that really addresses all of the elements of the question. I'm just looking back towards it. The practical reality, perhaps I will note on that, is that all markets are not theoretical markets. Theoretical markets can operate very simply, and they don't necessarily need interventions to help them coordinate. But real-world markets are determined by the boundaries of many things, including the way that politicians run the economy, and policies are designed to react to the multiple objectives that governments need to be addressing at the same point in time. And so let me try and calibrate that a tiny bit. If you imagine taking, for example, the SDGs, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are pulling you in multiple directions. You need education, you need natural resources, you need energy resilience, you need clean energy. And these, there's always going to be a conflict. And so if the question is towards the idea of can we eliminate the need for additional market influences such as command and control based policies, in a very real world, probably not. There's always going to be a mixture, always going to be a balance. But whether or not we are yet as adept in thinking about how frequently they can be revised to help maintain a balance and steer that balance towards our ultimate objectives, that may be a better question.
Yeah. Okay. The second question from Sudaskun is, are there any good policies to support to develop the renewable energy? Actually, it was one of my questions, so probably I can add more clarification about this question, in my opinion. So in terms of supporting expansion of renewable energy, one of the traditional debates was the effectiveness of regulation versus subsidy, so-called renewable portfolio standard versus feed-in tariff. It seems that FIT has an immediate effect, but government's fiscal burden will increase in the long term. And RPS will be more effective in the future, but the industrial burden will be pretty big, especially under the condition of lack of advanced technology. So currently, in addition, these two traditional policy instruments, we can also think of some market-based policy instruments like carbon tax and ETS having their own pros and cons. So given that the majority of this workshop participants are from developing countries, so what should be more relevant policy in developing countries context and setting?
Okay. Well, in some ways, I'd like to almost navigate away from those particular items. Feed-in tariffs, we've got a lot of experience in. The portfolio standards. We have experience in, and we know how carbon markets and things like this should be working. I think maybe there's one component on my slides I didn't get a chance to highlight, but when it comes to thinking about renewables, there's a very intriguing element which is going to be on the horizon, where forward planning may be a very useful thing, and policies relating to that forward planning may help. And this is the underlying resource problem. Especially if we think about renewables being provided by solar, then we often have to make use of materials which aren't always locally available. And we're slowly making transitions towards thinking not just around, how do we redefine the power market to facilitate power to be created for the economy and keep economic activity occurring, but building upon this, we're also beginning to think much more carefully about resource flows. Carbon pricing, I think the question which I find interesting is not so much the carbon taxes, but what are the consequences of things like the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And if you need to pay for the carbon consequences, the environmental consequences of the underlying resources as well, to create, for example, the solar panels which you wish to use, then that would be consequential to how much solar you can deploy. And so with this advanced movement towards circularity principles, towards carbon border adjustments, and really thinking about those resource deployments more carefully, I would think one additional angle would potentially be, well, how do you promote reuse and recycling of solar-related equipment to ensure that the technological opportunities from the same fundamental resources are really at the best available point? And maybe does there need to be some extra thought around, well, what kinds of materials maybe need to be put in place, given that further pricing consequences could be appearing in the horizon? Now that last one I say very reluctantly, because I'm almost hinting towards the possibility that, well, you may not have to pay the same price if you prepare for the resource problem today than if you prepare for it in the future, because you might need to pay for the externality in the future. And the economist in me says, well, that externality should be paid. If you're really trying to work out how do I get ahead, then there may be different opportunities.
Yeah, given that during your answer, you mentioned about the carbon border adjustment scheme. Actually, we have a question from Tan Do Hong. His question is how about cross-border trade between Singapore and other countries to promote the gain of net zero? Yeah, so yeah, it's not directly related to CBAM, but yeah, in the terms of the trade, maybe we can think of some possibility of achieving net zero at the global level or at the regional level. Yeah, about this question. So.
Okay, so could you just rephrase the first?
Yeah. How about cross-border trade between Singapore and other countries to promote the gain of net zero?
Yeah. So there's a few things which come to my mind when you phrase it the way that you phrase it. So if you take the context of Singapore, Singapore is going to be perhaps a little bit different from a lot of other economies, because actually we're not just fuel import dependent, we're import dependent for pretty much everything. And so our particular conditions in that sense may not be very, very perfectly correlated with everybody else. But I think what comes to my mind when I think about the range of problems which may be on the horizon, and I think about the idea of cross-border adjustments and everything like this, or border trade, where does the accounting need to balance out, and what are the opportunities for balancing the accounts one way or another? So we have offsets and things like this, and these mechanisms need to exist. So net zero is a global problem. The solution should be a global solution, but there will be localized conditions. And I think the questions around, well, how do we moderate that at the border of the economy are definitely important questions. And we can use strategies to make sure that we're not importing too many emissions, that we're not exporting too many emissions. But ultimately, there needs to be a version of the story which gets much more intelligent on the within economy processing. So they're perhaps some of my reflections there.
Okay. We have some questions from the panelists, Mr. David Broadstock. Yeah, so could you go ahead with your question? I think you're muted.
How can emerging economies actually energy transition towards zero carbon emissions, given the gaps in energy financing, institutional capacity and technology? So it's been a major challenge for emerging economies. So could you please shed some insights on this?
I fully caught the question.
Yeah, we're sorry, there is some noises. So could you repeat your question again?
Yeah, sure. I would like to know, how can the emerging economies accelerate transition towards the zero carbon emissions, given the gaps in energy financing, institutional capacity, and technology? So it's been a major challenge for emerging economies and the least developed countries like Nepal. So share me your insights on this. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I think I got the nature of the question. So this was why I wanted to use that wording in my presentation about the energy and financing puzzle. And actually, this is the set of questions which have most captured my attention that people have been asking me recently. What is this new energy and financing puzzle? And does it translate what was already a difficult task for targeting investment towards decarbonization into a near-term insurmountable task? And I don't like that question. I think that's a very concerning question, but it's the question which is actually coming through at the moment. I think at least one thing that can be done is some preliminary thinking around, well, what if you do have to do that? What if that's the consequence? What if that's the set of market conditions we're facing? How do you do that in a way which is going to be not detrimental to the decarbonization process? And so, in the discussions that at least I've been sharing with friends nearby, we begin to talk about the possibility of maybe needing to get more intelligent in terms of how we think about the process of decarbonization commitments, and then thinking about the potential consequences of, say, for example, and I'm not suggesting this is how to think about it, but if you take a thought process to the end, imagine you just say, okay, because of all of the market conditions, I now need to place a pause on decarbonization because I need to make sure that everything else comes forward, that basic economic sustainability and lives are not placed at risk because we're facing unusual conditions. Well, you then need to realize that the discount rates that you need to be using for evaluating the long-term decarbonization problem need to perhaps be differently defined. And that, at the moment we have got to a point within our planning for decarbonization of realizing that there's a fixed target, but we haven't necessarily gotten quite as far as realizing that the transition process could be a bit more variable. And then, because we haven't really presented that as a possibility, that decarbonization could be done at a slower pace when necessary and a faster pace when required or preferable, then we haven't yet also gone as far as thinking about, well, what are the set of mechanics and discussions which might be appropriate to actually lock in those financial flows that you want to have, those investment processes and so on. So I think this, it kind of correlates with what you're asking. What do I do? And in the past, 5 to 10 years, we've had a very firm recalibration of investment practices that make social stewardship of funding an acceptable practice. We haven't eliminated the basic fiduciary responsibilities of putting money first. That's something that some institutions have freedom to navigate around. Investment banks, development-related banks, they can have different criteria for deciding what to fund, how, and when. We have seen pension funds and similar that take clear responsibilities to allocate investment towards certain types of projects to maintain the social stewardship. But we have also begun seeing increasing levels of pushback in the private financing side of things towards investments that don't place money first, because enough people still recall fiduciary responsibility. You're supposed to be making me money. And so there's questions around that. Are we still having enough of a space where we can eliminate those basic constraints? Maybe there's additional discussion which can be had. So you know, again, I don't necessarily give a precise answer to your question. I think we're very much at a point of time where it may help to re-articulate the questions and actually think about, well, what are the other questions which we haven't needed to address, such as that idea of, for want of a better word, pausing decarbonization commitments. And I don't actually see it as that. I see it in my slides. Absolutely, there's no less importance in the decarbonization process. But as a relative problem, people at the moment aren't able to get food and are paying exceptionally high prices for food. And that just creates a different complexion. And so how then do we respond in such a way that the quality of policy commitment, the quantity and quality of policy commitment maintains a clear focus on the endpoint, even though it may do it a little bit more silently for the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay. I remember I've seen Mr. Len George raised his hand. So
Thank you, Dr. Kim.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry. So I had a question. I work with ADBI. I work in the Pacific region. We have a lot of small island countries there that have, you know, over the last 10 years announced very ambitious targets about decarbonization and going to net zero and carbon neutrality. I had a question. One was on the end goals, and the other was the process. So in terms of the end goals, yes, so a lot of these announcements were made, but particularly in a post-COVID world, particularly with what's happening after Russia and, you know, all the other kinds of pressures that countries face with food security and everything else, this is really a question, you know, where do you put your resources in, and what's the bigger problem to solve? And so when Singapore looks at it, how important is this 2050 target? You know, because I noted in your presentation, you had mentioned that it's not yet adopted in policy, but it's there. So how does the Singapore government look at this in terms of, you know, of the top 5 goals in Singapore, how important would something like this be? That's one. The second is, I think you briefly hinted on this in your presentation. You talked of the need to avoid path dependence, you know, as part of this whole energy transition process. And I was just curious in terms of, you know, what are a couple of, let's say, predominant paths or choices that are probably more prominent in the Singapore context today, but where you see there may be some changes over the next, say, 5 years, because it's quite likely that a market like Singapore could attract new technology, you know, which can then probably be used in the region. So how do you kind of keep yourself flexible and nimble there? What are the steps you're taking? Want to understand that a little better. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, David, before answering this question, let me incorporate another question to Mr. Len's question, because the first question is really overlapping. So I have a question from Ruan. Energy transition problem is an important problem globally, but Vietnam, we are also in the process of energy transition. However, we consider factors in order of priority, energy security, environment, and lastly is economy. And in your opinion, can the energy transition only apply to developed countries? Because for other developing countries, the issue of energy security and economy seems to more important. So I think this is quite similar question to Len's first question, like the kind of the top policy priorities and energy transitions relationship. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that one's easy to answer. I would go with no. The energy transition, it can be achieved everywhere, but there's different balances of resources that make it easier or harder. Well, let me try and take it all together though. So I think regarding Len's questions, they kind of come together. I'm not going to try to rank Singapore's specific activities. I'll lean away from that, and I won't talk towards exactly what's going on. I won't speak on behalf of the government as such. But I think you can look towards the revealed behaviors, and I think the reference to the 2050 targets, the long-term strategies, the decarbonization, the net zero commitment, is actually a very useful reference point if you think about what's been happening within Singapore, even just within the past couple of weeks. We've gone from the possibility of lowering emissions as far as possible within the second half of the century to decarbonization at some point after 2050 to trying to get net zero by 2050, and the policy narrative has been creeping in that direction, and so I think part of that story began well before the risks, the changing risks which we're facing in terms of thinking about how to modify the economy, the powertrain, and to achieve decarbonization. But many of them happened after, and that signals a very bold commitment. There is no sacrifice on those targets. In fact, there's a firming up on those targets. And I think that that's a very admirable approach, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself when I say that, but I think it's a very admirable approach because you are presented with conditions which say, well, you don't need to be more committed. You're being presented with examples of less committed approaches, and this is the narrative which is going towards, say, countries like Germany, where we're switching on coal power, and the argument that public opinion is very much that this is backtracking on commitments, and similar responses are being considered in many other places. So I think that's really the issue there, and the need to avoid path dependence. Well, that begins with that commitment to trust that you will be doing what needs to be done. And maybe part of the story, which is I think yet to be played out fully, is thinking back to that graph I had where I showed the tariff rate and I showed the cost of production. And there's one way to look at this, which is to say that there's a very clear imbalance, that there's a cost to providing energy which is not married against the costs of purchasing that energy, and there's many things you could say about that. There's similar stories occurring in many countries, but I think what comes with this is actually an interesting recognition that economies realize that the energy problems have become very severe and should not necessarily just be passed on to households and businesses, and that there's a very important role that governments must be playing, and then that those conditions have changed. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more discussion around that. So I think that level of commitment actually is not to be ignored. And where we see, let's say, a backtrack on those commitments, it might help understand how we continue to engage in a multilateral sense. Who do we need to talk to more, in which ways? I think if I was to make a prediction on where we're going with technologies, I wouldn't be at all surprised if hydrogen gets accelerated. But I think with the hydrogen market, we've been realizing that hydrogen and derivatives of this, ammonia and so on, they're close to being commercially viable in normal times. But they're certainly providing a lot of opportunity for large scale, quite clean energies if done appropriately. And those types of questions, I think, I would feel that nuclear hasn't achieved as much interest over decades. If it was really just about reliability of power supply, nuclear has always been an option. And also nuclear, I'm not an engineer, so I may be completely wrong in this, but my understanding is really that nuclear really requires very long lead times for deploying the technologies. Hydrogen is potentially more scalable more quickly, I believe, and so it may become an attractive solution. So I'm interested in watching that space. I'm optimistic.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's move the topic to the electricity market. So we have a question from Pasamon. If a country establishes its own electricity market and liberalizes its electricity sector, is it reasonable or logical to also liberalize an electricity fuel market like natural gas and even a hydrogen market?
Okay. Well, let's maybe try to attack that in this way. Open markets create competitive forces, which in many situations will hopefully organize the markets to the best available prices. That doesn't mean the lowest prices, it just means the ones where supply and demand conditions match against each other in a way that makes everybody in the market comfortable. And you know, that principle applies for kind of any market in any context, whether they're standalone markets or markets with complements, let's say. And so here we're just talking about that case where there's two complementary markets, one providing the input into the other. So as a basic principle, I'm okay with that. But I think the issue is when we talk about electricity markets is really just how complex they are. We don't have just an electricity spot market. There's very few places where it's just a spot market. You have a spot market, you have a futures market. I mean, if we take Singapore's context, what I find quite fun in some regards is this: we have a spot market and a futures market for electricity. Each one of those are so complex that most people can't understand them. Those that have been through this workshop, I think, now can. So that's great. But actually, for the layperson looking towards these are very complicated things. You can get visibility of data relating to these markets, but the data itself is complex. 30-minute settlements, forecasts on this, and you can download it, but again, comprehension of that data is quite hard. And then you add to this the fuel input and the complexity of that with its own spots and futures. But then you get to scratch the surface a tiny bit and you realize, well, that's not how it works. There's more. There's self-generation within the economy by certain companies. There's a gas market where you don't just purchase from spots and futures, you can establish long-term supply contracts. And Singapore has been quite progressive in that. And that means that there's a third price, which you don't know. And then that's going to impact market outcomes, but you can't track this. And then you have, for example, the idea that the gas markets and gas markets will apply to many people from many different countries. There are still elements, especially within Asia, that the gas markets are correlated with oil prices. The prices you pay are indexed against the oil price. And so in Singapore, for example, we're seeing the production costs for electricity move back towards a more comfortable point. Why? Well, it's not because gas prices are doing well. Gas prices are almost as bad now as they have ever been. They've begun tapering down a bit in the past few days again, but still they're at a very, very painful point. Mm. But what has happened is the oil prices come down. And because the oil prices come down, our use of gas to create electricity is now stabilized. And so, you know, I think those are actually the bigger issues. How do you remove the transparencies, the lack of transparencies actually, so that you can actually better monitor and moderate the potential consequences? And I think that we're still, like I say, I want to say this with some qualification. If you search for the impact, the research that really questions what is the impact of a change in the electricity price to the economy, to me, I'm overwhelmed by how little concrete research has been done on this. If you did the same for oil, you get a very clear understanding. But you know, some economies use varying degrees of oil. We all use electricity, and then you know you get to problems where tariff rates and user prices move at a very different speed to the production costs in the wholesale markets. And you know, again, I qualify that with, well, the tariff rate applies to one class of customers. It doesn't necessarily apply to all customer classes. But it's still very interesting to realize that there's such complexity in the information environment that maybe the questions about liberalization in inputs and outputs are maybe less important than just helping create a more unified price indicator or understanding of exactly what are the prices people pay, when do they filter through and how reactive do we need to be. This correlates with that question of, well, what now, given everything that we have seen, are going to be the consequences, and when will they actually pass through to us? And then how much may that create urgency to deal with the resilience problem over and above the environmental problem? And so that energy trilemma concern is quite salient. Just very quickly, whilst I have the floor for a second, I just want to go back to one question about the border trade concerns. I think there's actually a version of this story which is quite interesting when we look towards the transition to modern economies. You know, I like the version of the energy transition where we have smart technologies, where we have distributed resources, where we're making good use of data. That requires doing things like building out data centers. And there's certain industries which I think we also don't quite have a full handle on, which are electricity intensive, and may have quite intriguing properties that maybe at least stimulate some novel thinking. So for example, imagine Singapore is, you know, replete with data centers. It's become very well positioned in the data center industry for a number of reasons, infrastructure and so forth. But where do the emissions relating to the use of a data center account to? Who's responsible for those? Is it the Singaporean economy where the data center exists? Or is it over in the US, you know, some large software tech company who's storing data on the Singapore servers and using Singapore servers to do calculations that generates information and knowledge which is used to facilitate business in another country? And so, you know, as we begin to think about really the world we live in today and the directions in which it's going, we're still in some ways asking first order questions, and there's quite legitimate second order problems. The data center industry is a very interesting case study because it is energy intensive, electricity intensive, emissions intensive, and potentially very much non-point. And so when you go back to those borders and the competitiveness and how we deal with things, I think there's also quite intriguing questions there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And we have another question from Tan Do Hong. Do you think the design of electricity market need to adjust to fit with new context of energy transition, like integrated renewable energy into the market competition and dealing with the impacts of renewable energy on power grid operation and smart grid, something like that?
Yes, very good question. Certainly there needs to be adaptation, yes. There's a combination of soft and hard technological constraints, potentially. For example, in a fully distributed resource type network, electricity can flow multiple directions. And it's not always the case that electricity is permitted to even flow multiple directions along wires. So there may need to be actual physical infrastructure modifications, and certainly the bridges between different partners that could be trading with each other might need physical connections. But there's an intriguing soft side of the story. You know, especially for those of us fairly new to this, that we're attending the workshop and learning about the markets. And one thing which is quite common within markets is that you have many companies, many individual generators that submit bids for dispatch within every 30 minutes. And nowadays that's coming to be a 5-minute type of problem. And the dispatch problem is to say, well, I'm given a world of information, and given this world of information about who can produce what and is willing to do so at what price, I need to very quickly, and that's one of the important constraints there, very quickly determine what is the right mix to achieve this. And this is, you know, just a basic technical problem. Basic is not really fair. It's much more than just basic, but it's a technical problem. And then as you get towards the more interesting markets, especially if you think about wanting to optimize behaviors in real time, you know, you could say, well, let's not do 5 minutes. Let's make it shorter than this. Let's go to 30 seconds or something. But then the question has become, well, can you solve that dispatch problem? It's quite an intensive calculation process. Then as you make a transition to a more complex distributed resource system, you create the opportunities, not just for me to potentially offer electricity up to the grid, feed it in using some feed-in arrangement, but potentially I can trade with you individually, and you can trade with me, and we can sidestep needing to go directly through the central part of the grid. Well, what if that does happen? It means that the optimization problem from the regulated part of the grid and the baseload dispatch problems and things like this then have to deal with uncertainties. And there's just a very real computational problem there, which grows. The more distributed the system gets, the less certainty or less visibility you may have over all parts of the system. Now, again, you can work around that. You can say, well, there's blockchain and other technologies which can maybe capture information. But it doesn't make anything easier. It maybe makes things more interesting and creates new opportunities for optimization, but we impose additional complexities. So in short, yes, we do need to evolve. And the more we creep forwards, the more we need to be ready to evolve.
Okay, great. We have 48 seconds, and I think we addressed all the questions from the attendees. So now it's time to conclude our events. Thank you again, David, and all of attendees for listening and raising your questions. So let me invite Dr. Sitaram for wrapping up. Dr. Sitaram, over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to congratulate Dr. Kim for really moderating an excellent session, and Dr. David Broadstock for giving the initial lecture as well as handling all the questions very nicely. My appreciation and gratitude to our workshop participants who I know had a very long day, 4 hours yesterday and 4 hours today. So this is really not only energy, but renewable energy. I think everybody renewed their energy and enthusiasm and participated. I have spent time in various sectors, but more recently I'm spending my time in transport sector, which is like the elephant in the room, I think. It consumes, or it takes a giant share of energy demand, in some countries up to 30%. The pandemic has made us rethink. This is from a transport sector policy. Lots of transport infrastructure, mobility itself has been re-questioned, right? Because of IT, as what we are doing today, we are able to do something without having to physically travel, although we would like to travel. And that has reshaped maybe the demand or the requirement for energy consumption and use. Maybe it shifts from one to another, but certainly a new thinking. And I think that is now bringing a new wave of discussion in terms of energy security, but energy security for economy. At the same time, looking at economy differently, where mobility of goods and people have taken a new shape because the pandemic is once in a 100-year event. I think we are now relooking. The other aspect that we didn't discuss much today is what we are all going through, the natural vulnerabilities from natural and physical hazards, which can cause disasters. Even developed countries like Japan is going through. Right now, as we speak, there's a very extreme weather condition, a typhoon, and many places are destroyed. Yes, energy, if energy is interrupted, many things don't work. And that is a huge challenge. And that's where we look at new ways of securing energy from own resources, or also getting from countries which have new forms of energies available. This year, with my colleague Dina Asgalia, who also used to work incidentally at the NUS Energy Studies Institute, we're doing a project on hydrogen and how to look at developing countries as not only a user, but also a source of hydrogen resource, and which may create a new opportunities for us to look at energy security. So I think this workshop and the particular session today fits very well with the new challenges that we are facing and maybe new thinking that we need. And I hope we'll all put our heads together and celebrate that we are well prepared with the sharing of knowledge that has happened today. Let me congratulate and thank the speaker as well as the moderator, and also my colleagues Nia, Veronica, and Akiko Hiraoka, who have been supporting from the behind to put it together. Thank you all, and have a very good afternoon or evening wherever you are.